This is Bonjour Hi, the Chickens for KFC edition. I'm Avi Feingold, and I'm here with Phoebe Maltz-Bovey and special guest host Gabby Deutsch. We are your Frozen Chosen. On today's show, we talk about Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to the American Congress. We talk about a potential Kamala Harris presidency. And fear not, we get into what implications all of this has for Canada's Jews. Stay tuned. I only know this because I went camp shopping with my kid a couple weeks ago. There's this statement. Gabby, have you ever heard this statement, live 10 for 2?
I have, as a proud camp person. I'm very familiar.
Phoebe, have you heard of live?
No, I don't know this expression.
Gabby, can you explain to Phoebe what live 10 for 2 is?
I can. I will just say I grew up going to Camp Ramah. So for any Ramonics who are listening, glad to have you with us. 10 for 2 is you live the other 10 months of your life for the 2 months that you're at camp in the summer. And so it's saying the rest of the year, what a slog. We push through it just to get to the magical 2 months of summer camp.
Ah, I see.
And as a parent, I say, yeah, 100% that.
Who is Gabby? Have you introduced who this is?
I have not yet.
Okay. This is Gabby Deutsch, senior national correspondent at Jewish Insider, who we're very happy to have back on the program because one or two tiny little things have happened in U.S. politics with Jewish significance. Avi, you wanted to start with good old Bibi.
Good old Bibi. Bibi Netanyahu spoke in Congress on Wednesday. I assume you heard the speech as it was being recorded, Gabby. I assume you were not in the room because I heard that it was incredibly hard to be crammed into that. What were your main takeaways from the historic, from what I understand, fourth address to Congress?
I think it's both important to look at what he said and also everything that happened around it. Throughout the war, since October 7th, there has been a question among members of Congress about whether to invite Bibi to speak. And a growing number of Democrats have become more and more critical of Israel and the way that Israel is carrying out the war in Gaza. And just to backtrack even more before getting into this speech, Bibi spoke to Congress in 2015 as well, which was kind of this pivotal moment in U.S.-Israel relations because he was invited by the Republican Speaker of the House, who famously went behind President Obama's back. And at that point, Israel wasn't seen quite as much as a partisan issue, but so many Democrats just felt betrayed by the way this had happened, going behind Obama's back. And so at that point, a number of Democrats skipped the speech, but that was more making a political statement of supporting Obama, who was seen as liberal on Israel, but generally, I think, supportive. And that was also happening amid the debate over the Iran deal. So all of that is in the backdrop for this speech, where it turned out there were, I think, more than double the number of Democrats who skipped the speech on Wednesday as had done so in 2015, which reflects, I think, growing dissatisfaction with the war, pinning all of that really on Bibi. There are a number of Democrats who called him a war criminal. Mark Pocan, who's a congressman from Wisconsin, said that if there were an arrest warrant out for Bibi's arrest, he would have gone to the House floor and handed it to him himself. So the emotions were really high. And there was this question of whether people would come and protest. And that ultimately didn't happen. You had many Democrats skip the speech, but within the room, the only person who was really protesting was Rashida Tlaib, who is a Palestinian-American member of Congress from Michigan. She was sitting wearing a keffiyeh with a Palestinian flag and holding up a sign that sort of looked like the things that you hold at an auction that said war criminal on it, that she held up when Bibi was speaking.
So just to zoom out for context even more, it's not like everybody in Israel itself is a tremendous supporter.
Right.
I just wanted to ask, though, how that impacts like what it means in the U.S. If you don't support Netanyahu, that doesn't necessarily mean you don't support Israel.
That's definitely true. And I think among the people who skipped the speech, there are a good number who are in that camp of having concerns with Bibi's leadership. A very large number of Israelis do as well, as you pointed out. People who still feel connected to Israel, generally supportive, but think that perhaps Bibi is not doing enough to reach a hostage and ceasefire deal, is prolonging the war for his political gain, and, someone who has put very far-right incendiary politicians in positions of power. And then there were also some, like Rashida Tlaib, who, although she was actually at the speech, but who are coming at it in a much more critical way, and a small but growing number of people who I think could fairly be described as anti-Israel. But to the point that you made about the opposition Bibi faces in Israel, a number of the members who skipped the speech instead spent the time meeting with the families of hostages. And then there were even a number of family members of hostages who were in the audience, and there's very strict rules when you're watching something in the House chamber about having to dress professionally, and you can't have your phone. And so a number of these family members of hostages unbuttoned their shirts and were wearing shirts underneath that I believe said "Seal the deal now." And they were taken out and arrested, and I think released, but to make a point to Bibi. So all of that is in the backdrop before even getting to what he said. And I think the hope, certainly from the family members of hostages, was that he would take the speech to announce a hostage deal, a ceasefire deal. That did not happen. Nowhere even close, frankly. And, we have American officials who have been saying, even yesterday, someone said to me that a possible hostage and ceasefire deal is close to the finish line. We've been hearing that for a few weeks, so I'm a little skeptical. But really what Bibi did in his speech was sort of give a pep rally for Israel.
Yeah. And I was going to say, is it just me, or was it a real big nothing burger of a speech in that nothing was really said that you didn't actually expect already?
I think that's a fair way to put it. I think,
although nothing burger is a bad assessment because he did refer to KFC though in the speech. It was something like, I see you having signs that say gays for Gaza. That's like saying chickens for KFC.
Oh boy.
Right. Exactly.
I'm sure that will convince Queers for Palestine to have completely different politics.
Yes, exactly. I think that there was nothing in the speech that would convince anyone who was a skeptic of Bibi, anyone who does not support Israel. It was the kind of speech that, I think he would have given 8-10 years ago at the AIPAC conference to big applause from his biggest fans. And because so many people skipped, most of the people in the room were really his biggest supporters. There were a lot of standing ovations, mostly from Republicans. A lot of the Democrats who were there stayed sitting, were not quite as enthusiastic. But if I were to tell you, what's the top line from the speech, what's the takeaway, it's, Israel is locked in this existential battle against Hamas, which is really against Iran, and we need total victory. That's the word that he used, which I don't think is any different from the message he's been giving this whole war and, frankly, his whole career about Iran.
So would you say that more of the Jewish Congress members were enthusiastic, or were there more Jewish Congress people unenthusiastic, or were they more clustered in the meeting with hostages and not going to speech side? Where did they fall in both Republicans and Democrats?
There's very few Jewish Republican members, but they were all there and very enthusiastic. And then among the Democrats, I think most of them were there, and some of them were in that more enthusiastic camp. Jerry Nadler, who is a Jewish member of Congress from New York, who's a more liberal Democrat, sort of old school liberal Zionist, and put out a statement before the event calling Bibi the worst Jewish leader in 2,100 years. Oh. And then he showed up to the speech early, reading a book by an Israeli journalist, like sort of a salacious biography of Bibi. And he was sitting on the House floor holding up the book above his face, and actually sitting very close to Rashida Tlaib and her keffiyeh. So there were some pretty
lovely
photos next to each other. But there were some Jewish Democrats also who skipped. Sarah Jacobs is a Jewish member of Congress from California. She is, I think, in her early 30s, the youngest Jewish member of Congress, and she made a point of skipping. She's more progressive. So there was definitely a mix, but I would say overall, I think as we have seen, it was the Jewish members of Congress who went, and certainly also spent time meeting with the hostages as well, or the families of hostages.
I was thinking about it in contrast to the speeches that Zelensky has been making to Congress in the past couple of years, where there were specific requests, specific demands, something that was concretely being said that was different. It feels almost as if either Netanyahu was hoping to actually say something and there was no deal that was made in time, and so therefore the speech had to be altered. Or at the end of the day, there's really nothing that America isn't doing that needs to be reiterated or repeated. And this kind of weakens the position of, Israel to say that we need America stronger than ever. America's already doing everything that it can for Israel, and this is just an underline. And I'm not sure that that's useful in this context, and I guess that's why I am having a hard time with the nature of this speech.
I think if there was anything he asked for, it was for more American aid to get to Israel faster. And I think that there are some questions about whether American military assistance has, been moved to Israel as quickly as it could. But he started the speech really thanking Biden, praising him at length, talking about Biden traveling to Israel soon after October 7th. And I think that was a big question mark because his last speech in 2015 was seen as so partisan. And so he started by talking about Biden, and I think that probably did a lot for the Democrats in the room. Of course, he also had a big section about Trump.
I was going to say that I feel like, again, this speech has been rewritten in the past week simply because of whatever events were going on, and this was likely going to be a much more partisan speech that had to be shifted because all of a sudden the nature of the election has changed, and therefore he has to hedge his bets.
Absolutely. And I think what's important to keep in mind about the Trump mention is that after Biden was elected in 2020, Bibi reached out to congratulate him, a very common occurrence in world events. And Trump reportedly was very unhappy about it because this was when Trump was saying that the election was stolen, that Biden had only won from fraudulent votes, and he thought that Bibi was choosing Biden over him. So when Bibi has this whole section talking about how amazing Trump is for Israel, I think some of that can still be seen as trying to get back in his good graces and, like you said, hedging his bets.
So Harris, Kamala Harris, vice president, presumptive Democratic nominee for president, was among those who missed the speech. And this was significant because it was her first joint session that she was missing, right, as vice president?
That's right. And usually she's sitting right behind the speaker next to the Speaker of the House. So her not being there was very clear to everyone.
So J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee, also missed the speech, but for some reason nobody cares, or at least not. I haven't heard as much about this. But what was the significance of Harris in particular, but maybe both of their missing this, particularly Harris on account of her current role?
Sure. I'll talk about Vance very briefly first. I think you're right. He's not facing the same kind of political pushback. And part of that, I think, is attributable to Republicans being the ones who are more willing to use Israel as a political argument. And they're willing to say, hey, wait a second, why isn't Kamala Harris here? She must not be pro-Israel. Whereas there's fewer Democrats who care as much about that to make that a cogent part of their argument against J.D. Vance. I did actually yesterday talk to someone I know who worked in the Trump administration and who works at a conservative think tank doing foreign policy. And he had gone on Twitter and criticized Kamala Harris for not being at the speech. And I said, what do you think about J.D. Vance not being there also? And he responded, well, everyone knows that Trump and Vance are pro-Israel, and we don't know that about Biden and Harris, which I thought was very interesting and telling because, Biden calls himself a Zionist, presents himself as very pro-Israel, and the people around Kamala Harris say the same about her, but there are questions, not necessarily is she anti-Israel, but she's just said less about it than Biden, and especially since becoming the likely nominee all of 4 days ago, has not spoken about any of this. She hasn't put out any statements about Netanyahu, talked about the speech. She's meeting with him this afternoon, so maybe by the time your listeners hear this, that will already have happened.
I do kind of want to put a pin in this whole thing with Vance, because is it assumed, like I would not assume that J.D. Vance was pro-Israel. That is not an assumption I would make. As I understand it, he's isolationist. He's America first-ish. He wants a Christian country. And he seems kind of in the spirit of a Sarah Palin, a Mike Huckabee, or even a Pat Buchanan. To me, this seems like the sort of person, even aside from the fact that a hillbilly seems like sort of something Jews would probably not have much to do with, although I guess he's critical of hillbilly culture, as I understand it, in his best-selling Hillbilly Elegy. Is it assumed, can he be taken for granted as a pro-Israel candidate? Is he presenting himself as one?
He's presenting himself absolutely as pro-Israel. You raised the point about him being isolationist, which I think is really important. He and a number of other Republicans who have really come to be associated with this America First foreign policy, very isolationist, very, very critical of American support for Ukraine and its war against Russia. He and others like that have tried to make a point of separating Israel out from there. And I've tried to talk to people about this, and they say, well, our relationship with Israel is different. They provide more benefits for us than Ukraine or other countries do. It's more of a two-way street. But among a lot of Jewish Republicans and more conservative hawks, there's definitely concern. Vance was not the favorite at all, because the thinking is, even if right now he says he's pro-Israel, and maybe he'll stay that way, whatever that means to him, by elevating him and elevating someone of this worldview, does it then start giving more space to people who call themselves isolationist, who do not make an Israel exception, and bringing that in? And so he was someone who was not at all seen as the first pick of Jews on the right.
Right. So that's the other part I wanted to ask was specifically about Jews and not about Israel, which is, and I'm thinking here more of Vance as a kind of very online right-wing figure, very much in the spirit of the kind of young, angry online man who might be posting angrily on the internet. And he has a bit of that vibe, right? A little bit. Like, do Jewish voters who might have otherwise seen Trump as who might have otherwise gritted their teeth and voted for Trump because anti-Semitism, because Israel, something like that, is Vance likely to perhaps shift things away?
I don't think so. I think for Jews who were going to vote for Trump, I think that a lot of them don't love Vance as the pick. But I don't think that will be reason not to support Trump for them. He's very much of the right in that isolationist worldview. I don't see, when you talk about these men online on the right and the things that they're posting, I don't see him in that camp of the sort of, I don't know, very problematic, anti-Semitic-ish online right. I suppose maybe Trump could have picked someone with more of the substance to wait out some of the Trumpiness, and I don't think that necessarily was the choice. But I don't see the Vance pick affecting people who are considering voting for him.
My sense is that Vance was there to appeal to the evangelicals, even though famously he converted to Catholicism about 5 years ago, something along those lines. And that as somebody who's appealing to evangelicals, that is a very, very pro-Zionist, pro-Israel approach. It's the thing that's been really on my mind. This whole idea of bringing somebody in as somebody to be a good for the Jews candidate or whatever it is. What else do we have? And I say this not because I support this, but the opposite of this. The only position that seems to be what Jews, quote unquote, care for as Jews is this good for Israel? I don't even know what are the issues that Jews care about aside from it, because the anti-Semitism is lumped into it together these days. And as a result, the only issue that Jews, quote unquote, seem to care about when they go and say, as a Jewish voter, I'm curious about, always seems to be about Israel.
I don't think that's quite true. I think within the most involved, connected Jews, which is a relatively small percentage, but those are the ones who are very online, who are very, the ones who are talking about this the most. I do think Israel's a big concern. I think for most Jewish voters, the things that they care about and the reason that so many Jews are Democrats in America and on the left is because of abortion. I mean, abortion is huge for Jews in general and Jewish women in particular this year after Roe v. Wade was overturned. And that's something that's highly motivating. And then all of these other social issues that have pushed Jews to vote for candidates on the left. I think Israel is something that's very important to a lot of people. I would say in the vast majority of elections, it doesn't really register as a concern. This year might be different because of the really intense moment that we're in. The war is still going on. It's likely to either still be happening in November or at the very least, if, thank God, there is some kind of deal reached before then, we'll still be dealing with the political aftermath. And so, and the anti-Semitism, as you mentioned, that is often connected to Israel this year in particular. So I do think that perhaps more than usual, that will cause people to either rethink their vote or just ponder that more as they're making their decisions. Is this candidate I'm supporting good for Israel? But even more than that, to be a little bit more nuanced, are they empathetic toward what happened on October 7th, toward the Israeli hostages? Or are they someone who is saying very incendiary things? Who are they giving a platform to? And you saw at the Republican National Convention last week that the Republicans are making a play for Jewish voters on the left who they think are disillusioned with the anti-Semitism on the left. And I think you have to acknowledge that it's real, it's growing, it's deeply problematic. I don't think it's at the level of the leaders of the Democratic Party, but the Republicans are trying to make this play that look at all of this dysfunction, this hatred, this animosity. Why do you want to be associated with that? Come hang out with us. Like they had the parents of an American hostage who's in Israel spoke on the main stage of the Republican convention, and people were chanting, "Bring them home." And they had Shabbos Kestenbaum, who's a student who just graduated from Harvard, an Orthodox Jewish student who became a very vocal advocate against anti-Semitism, who has voted for Democrats his whole life and most recently Bernie Sanders, and is now thinking about giving up on that because he feels like Democrats aren't taking anti-Semitism within the party seriously. And I don't know how many people like him there are going to be, but it is more of an open question than I think in a typical election year.
Yeah, I mean, I do want to just really sort of reemphasize the amount that there are just a lot of sort of enthusiastic Democrats, enthusiastic proponents of what the detractors of it would call wokeness are Jews. And that is a lot of American Jews. And that is the world I come from. And that is it's real, it's out there. And I was thinking about this in terms of, so the types of posts where people are like, fellow white ladies, get it together, vote for Harris. Have you seen these sorts of?
I have been seeing them and cringing a little bit.
Okay. So one of the very cringy ones, is getting a big pile-on, and some of it seemed fair. But I do think there is something to be said for, I think there are a lot of people who are just earnest progressives who are very much going to be on the earnest progressive side because of Jewish values. And I don't think that is inaccurate.
I think absolutely that's still the case this year. And for many Americans who identify as broadly, American Jews in particular, who identify as broadly supportive of Israel, their vision of being pro-Israel is not what the Republicans are saying. It's, whoa, I'm not mad that you didn't skip Bibi's speech because I hate that guy too. And so seeing that from Democrats, I think for a lot of Jews is not something that's turning them away. I think also something that I should have mentioned before when talking about the Republican play, very overt play for Jewish votes, a number of people have pointed out, especially as we've seen with Elise Stefanik, who's the member of Congress who questioned the university presidents about anti-Semitism last fall. she's someone who has promoted the Great Replacement theory, which at its core is anti-Semitic. And so there are some paradoxical ways of thinking within the Republican Party.
They have done a very good job of hiding the anti-Semitism on the right,
exactly,
at least until after the election. And I'm curious if this is one of those stand back and stand by moments where, the day after a Trump victory, we'll have another event like happened in Charlottesville. And then at that point, it'll be like, well, it's too late now. We won. And
well, this might be the segue to talk about who, because I think a lot of this would depend on who was the vice presidential pick for the Democrats. Because something I've wondered is if it's Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, would he, as a observant Jewish, pro-Israel, not uncritically so, but pro-Israel politician, would that inoculate the Democrats from charges of anti-Semitism? But this is going to be a two-parter, okay? Would it also free up the Republicans to engage in a little bit of populist anti-Semitism because they're no longer able to really run on the pro-Jewish sort of thing?
I think to answer the second question first, even if Shapiro is named as Harris's running mate, I think you'll still see Republicans trying to say the Democrats are anti-Semitic. Look at these crazy pro-Hamas protesters who were in Washington yesterday under the auspices of a pro-Palestine protest, who came and, burned American flags and wrote Hamas is coming on a big statue. It would be harder with Shapiro. Shapiro, as I've heard in many conversations, is beloved by Jews from across the political spectrum, including, I think, many, many Republicans who, first of all, think it's great to have someone so visibly Jewish in that role, but who view him as more of a moderate, as someone reasonable, like the guy that you would see and hang out with in Shul. And I think if Harris were to pick him, I think if there are Jewish Democrats who are more on the moderate side, who might be skeptical of where Harris is on Israel, and we didn't quite close this loop before, but just to very briefly finish talking about that, she's someone who has called herself pro-Israel, but has spoken a bit more on the left when it comes to the war, when it comes to Gaza, and also talking about protesters on American campuses. I think we'll see after her meeting with Netanyahu today what she says publicly. That's something I'll be watching very closely. But broadly, I think pro-Israel, even if it looks different for her than it does for Biden. But to answer the Shapiro question, I think if she picks Shapiro, if there are Jews who are questioning where she is, I think with Shapiro next to her, that will.
I don't know if that's true, because I think many Jews had no problem voting against Lieberman, even though he was very similar to Shapiro in terms of ideology, both Jewishly and not. And the Jews that wanted to vote Republican that year had no problem saying, "I know that he's Jewish, but this is the vote that I'm going for."
That's absolutely right. And I think everything that we're talking about is really the fringes, small numbers, because most Jews are going to vote Democrat no matter what, because they care about abortion and they care about gay rights and they care about all the other issues that Democrats care about. And, 25% to a third of Jews are going to vote Republican because that's what polling has shown they've been doing for many, many years at this point. And so it's really a small number who I think, the campaigns are trying to reach. And so it's those few that might be swayed. But I think overall, who Harris picks won't necessarily, in the same way that Trump picking Vance just won't have a huge impact on who people will be supporting.
I think that they got caught very flat-footed. I think that this was an appeal to the evangelicals, Trump picking Vance, because he thought he had a lock with Biden, and that now that the election has completely shifted, I think that they would have absolutely picked a different VP. They might have picked somebody a lot more moderate, a lot more appealing to, the left, but that's moot, so it doesn't matter. What I'm curious about is regardless of the VP pick, what do you imagine the Harris candidacy looks like appealing to Jewish voters in the next 3 months?
It's a great question. In some ways, still waiting to see. Yesterday,
I'm asking for your prognostications.
Yeah. Well, the question that I want to answer is, now that we have a different person than the president who's running as the Democrat this year, how will she differentiate herself, if at all? Will she try to say, I'm just following Biden, I'm in his administration, I support him, we're on the exact same page, which is the message that we're getting from aides and advisors, but she isn't really saying anything yet. So definitely waiting to see. But yesterday there was an event from a political group, the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and they brought on Second Gentleman Doug Emhoff, Kamala Harris's Jewish husband, and he was essentially there making the pitch to Jewish voters and saying, basically, she's married to me. She took me to Israel when she was in the Senate. She had been before, and Doug Emhoff, famously before being the second gentleman, had not been very connected to the Jewish community or engaged on Jewish things. And so he came on to talk about how it was his wife who wanted him to see Israel. They went together. He talked about how in his work in the administration as someone focusing on anti-Semitism, she's been supportive, she's cheered him on, she sees how important it is to be connecting with the Jewish community. And he also talked about how it's important to her to support Israel. So that, I think, is the message from people around her of just trying to get people like Emhoff, who is also really adored within the American Jewish community, just in front of more audiences. But again, I'm waiting to see what she actually says.
Okay, yes. So something I wanted to talk about also was so we're talking about the need for the Harris campaign to reassure that she is a friend of Israel. There's also the need for the Harris campaign to reassure that she is not too much of a friend of Israel. And I was wondering specifically about the symbolism of her attending a Black sorority conference rather than the Netanyahu speech. Because yes, it seems like this was already planned and not that she was like, of all the things in the world to do, this is what I'm going to do. But I feel like this does send a message to younger voters, to voters of color, to voters who are not for, like in demographics that are not particularly rah-rah Israel. It would probably seem reassuring. It's not the same as she's not out there joining the protest. She's not graffitiing a monument, but she's, it's a gesture. I don't know.
I think there might be some truth to that. But again, I think to a certain extent, we're all guessing until we hear what she has to say after the Netanyahu meeting. But since Biden announced that he wouldn't be running again, we have seen from the left, and particularly the anti-Israel left, relief that Biden won't be on the ballot, and a cautious hope that Harris might be better on going after Israel than Biden is. Now, they don't have a ton to go off of. They have some comments she's made over the past several months, speaking more empathetically about the protesters, talking more about the suffering of people in Gaza. But they see it as an opportunity, and she hasn't said anything yet, so no one really knows, but there's definitely a balance, and where she comes down will be super, super revealing. And you've also seen that very online left community going after, in huge numbers, Josh Shapiro this week.
Oh, yes.
Because he's a Zionist, which we can put 3 parentheses around, because they're only going after the Jewish Zionist, and there's a deep fear that she's going to pick Shapiro. And, again, those voices, I think.
Well, this is very interesting, just to jump in, though, because I'm just wondering, how much would Shapiro repel the people who don't want this, but not really make a difference either way for the ones who do?
Well, I think for the people on the left who are very anti-Israel, they have been deceiving themselves, I think, for quite a while in all of this. Again, we'll see what Harris actually says, but even when she's been slightly more sympathetic to the Palestinians, she still describes herself as very pro-Israel. I think what we've seen from these movements, they're not willing to accept anything less than America saying, we hate Israel and we're never going to be aligned with them again. So even if she were to throw them a small bone, I don't think it would actually really
It also doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, they're not voting for anybody else.
Well, they might not vote for anybody.
Well, it's the argument they're making is, if we don't turn out, you're not going to win. You need our votes. But then the other calculation, and while Shapiro might help with the Jews, there's not that many of us, is will he help win Pennsylvania, which is a key state, and other moderates, the people who do vote.
I was going to say, there's not that many really radical pro-Palestinian lefties in the 6 swing states that actually matter.
Yeah, I think that is true. And that's what a lot of Jewish Democrats are arguing, pay attention to us. We're aligned more broadly with moderates and centrists and the people who you actually need to win, the people who show up to vote, rather than this radical contingent who is just kind of making a fuss and isn't really going to have an impact on the election anyway.
So I would say, though, there has been a huge, pro-Palestinian protest movement internationally, and I think opinion does seem to shift. Things do change. And I guess I'm wondering, because I just saw in Time magazine, there was an op-ed arguing that the U.S.-Israel alliance should end. Is that a likely scenario in the first 4 years of a Harris, or whatever you call it, first 4 years of a Trump-Vance administration?
No, I don't see that happening under Trump. I don't see it happening under Harris. I think the question with Harris is who's she surrounding herself with, who has sway, but that's not going to happen under a Harris administration, which is why I think the activists on the far left are never going to be happy with her no matter what. I think that's something that Jewish Democrats are afraid of for down the line, seeing young people.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I do wonder, because I think a lot of what sort of facilitates so much American Jewish progressivism is that you sort of feel that you can vote Democrat without really risking anything particular to do with Israel, and that that it's effectively, you're going to get a pro-Israel candidate either way. One way, abortion, IVF, all these things, birth control, it's all sort of, anything to do with LGBT. You get all these other things. And education, right? Higher education, which side is going to fund it or not? There are a lot of things that sort of a Jewish progressive would likely care about. That you can have all that there isn't necessarily a trade-off. Whereas I think, to internationalize this a little bit, in Europe, even in Canada, you might feel like you have to choose a little bit more. And I think something unique about the US is that you wouldn't.
Well, I think the fear is that one day American Jews will. Right. And I think some people are feeling that in more local elections. Mm-hmm. I think at the presidential level, even if Harris ends up coming out as more to the left than Biden, she'll still very broadly be, without a doubt, in that pro-Israel camp. But I think the concern is, will America become more like those other countries in Europe, for example? We think about Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, or in France, where Macron just made an alliance with these parties on the far left who have said horrible things about Israel since October 7th. And you saw the head of the main Jewish communal organization there basically tell Jews, you have two bad options here, sorry. And we're not there in America. And I think that there was, before October 7th, but really even a few years before that, a feeling that we were different and separate from those concerns. And I think now it's a question of, will we get there? When will that be? But certainly there's deep fear, I think, in the American Jewish community about that happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you can speak to this, Gabby, but we will likely have an election following the American election up here in Canada. Do you think that there's any knock-on effect one way or another based on how the vote turns out in November in the U.S. for how things will shake out in Canada, especially vis-a-vis Israel?
Best as I can tell, there is more willingness. Conversely, how I was what I was just saying about American Jews who are progressive feeling pretty confident that they could vote for a Democrat without having to sacrifice pro-Israel stuff. I think conversely in Canada, you have Canadian Jews feeling like you can vote for a more conservative candidate without necessarily sacrificing universal health care or gun control You know what I mean? Or same-sex marriage or whatever it is. And I think there's more of a sense just that the right in Canada, unless you're talking about the far right, whatever, isn't necessarily going to mean anything that would be so like out of keeping with values, which is, I think, what does give, when Canadian conservatives try to play up anti-Semitism, first of all, I think anti-Semitism is different in Canada and the US, although maybe the differences are decreasing. But I think conservatives have a better shot in Canada than Republicans do in the US of attracting Jewish voters with this type of thinking, simply because there aren't these same trade-offs.
Anecdotally, in conversations with friends of mine who are Canadian or who have family in Canada, have heard the same thing, that not that, the liberals and conservatives in Canada are all the same, but in America, the bridge between the parties is so far, and the Republican Party has moved so much further to the right in recent years, that to vote Republican, a Jewish Democrat, is giving up so much and choosing an entirely different vision of the country. And so that raises the stakes of that decision a little bit.
The fact that the issues are not the same issues means that what we are seeing over the past year, which is really the wholesale abandonment by many, many Jews of the left side of Canadian politics, is simply because they can do that without fearing any of the other stuff, happening.
Oh my God, I feel so happy. I feel like I've really become Canadian, that I answered the question coherently, because when you first said it, my brain went back to that, like, what's a Canada? Like, where am I? But this now I feel like I've really earned my place at the Canadian Jewish News.
Congratulations.
I can't date women right now because I'm too busy calling myself a piece of shit.
I had a dysfunctional Jewish mother and I had a dysfunctional Native mother.
I had 25 full years of utter struggle and failure.
I started to realize the absurdity of my inability to let go of this monster of guilt.
Sounds like fun, doesn't it? Hi, I'm Ralph Benrig. I'm the host of Not That Kind of Rabbi, where we look at people's spiritual journeys and take a little time for their self-reflection, and maybe yours. You can get it all at thecjn.ca/NTKR, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Gabby, you have some nachas for us?
I do. Like both of you, I am immersed in Jewish things, and often a lot of depressing Jewish things all the time lately. And I met someone recently who I was talking to, a rabbinical student, who was telling me about all the podcasts she listens to from Hadar and rabbis and all of this Jewish text and Jewish teachers, and helped me realize that even though I spend all my days reading news about these things, it's not the same as Jewishly engaging and thinking about Jewish texts and not being just immersed in sort of the modern stressful news. So I started reading Rabbi Sharon Brous' new book called The Amen Effect, and it's fantastic, and I recommend it.
I will second that one. Phoebe.
I do. I'm going to do a nachas, but it's not particularly Jewish. It is particularly parent-related, which is I'm going to endorse the phenomenon of learn to ride a bike day camp for children.
Oh my God.
Which is something that I had never heard of until like a matter of months ago. And it works. Not 100% of the time, but it does work. I have a kid who can ride a bike, and I had a kid who couldn't ride a bike. So instead of a sort of painstaking, potentially months-long process with a lot of screaming where you and your kid are struggling and in whichever gentle parenting manner that takes place in the modern world, what you do is you send your kid to day camp with a bunch of their friends, ideally, and teenagers who look like they're about 10 but are probably about 16 teach your kid, with the help of peer pressure and youthful energy, how to ride a two-wheel bike without training wheels, and then they can do it, and it's amazing. And I cannot recommend that enough. So that's my nachas for the week.
double endorse that. Not only that, but I think that the success of it leads me to want to create a whole set of other summer camps for kids, like day camps, where like make your own lunch camp and do your own laundry camp becomes a thing where like 6-year-olds can learn how to put stuff in and decide what like setting to put on the machine and how to like this could be groundbreaking for parenting.
So what have you got, Avi? Although that, or was it that? Because that's pretty good.
It was very, very close to that, but it's not that exactly. And it goes back to our initial conversation about summer camp and the Live 10 for 2 and all of that. There's a wonderful article from Atlas Obscura from about a month ago called The Anxious History of the American Summer Camp. The annual rite of passage has always been more about the ambivalence of adults than the amusement of children. And it's about how summer camps basically developed in the early part of the 20th century, late part of the 19th century, mainly over parents worried about their children and not being self-reliant anymore and giving them these skills of like being out in the wilderness and doing stuff and developing like, you know, stuff on their own, almost not quite Lord of the Flies, but close enough. And that it's summer camp often ends up being more about parents, not so much about the vacation that they need from day-to-day grind of dealing with parents, dealing with their kids, which is a good side effect and I think is important and should not be undervalued and not be in the like, oh my God, I can't deal with my kids sort of way, but in the, I'm afraid that I can't teach my kids certain things and therefore they need to go and be immersed in this. And as I was reading this, all I kept thinking about was the Jewish summer camp development and experience is very similar in the sense of like, I can't give my kids the Judaism that I really wish that they had, and therefore I'm going to send them to Jewish summer camp. And that led to the success of so many Jewish summer camps, especially the Ramah movement, whose backbone was really this idea of like, well, you want to live a deeply Jewish life for 2 months straight. We're going to immerse you in this over and over again every summer. So you're going to have that as a core part of your youthful experience. And the rise of Jewish summer camps really mirrors that in a very similar way.
Let me add one funny story just to follow that with. As you're talking about sleepaway camp, a very Jewish phenomenon. Even the camps that aren't Jewish are kind of Jewish for the most part, at least in America. And I grew up in Florida, and my dad was recently on a flight, and he also went to Camp Ramah. He was recently on a flight that happened to have a whole group of maybe 30 kids who were flying to Camp Stone, an Orthodox camp. And my dad saw all these Jewish kids. He was so excited. He talked to them. They spent this whole time talking about camp. And then the woman sitting next to him on the plane turns to him and said, wow, that's crazy that those parents are sending their kids away for 2 months. And just a very hard thing to explain to someone who doesn't, like, you kind of get it or you don't. But what you're describing, Avi, is exactly right.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending July 27th, Shabbat Parashat Pinchas. The show is produced by Michael Freeman and edited by Zach Kaufman. The executive producer for CJN Podcast is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So-Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and are distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can listen to all our past episodes on our page at thecjn.ca/bonjour, and you can subscribe to the podcast and automatically receive all episodes on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love it if you told a friend about Bonjour Chai. It is one of the best ways we get new listeners. And as always, please email us with comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca.
Y'all remember that joke from Airplane? The old lady asked for some light reading.
How about this leaflet, famous Jewish sports legends?
But in actuality, that's changing. Jews are crushing it in sports around the world, and we are here to celebrate them.
Sandy Koufax gets his 10th strikeout.
Zach Hyman, his first career hat trick. 41 points for Diddy Avdia. It's Sue Bird's building.
I'm Gabe.
And I'm Jamie.
We love Jews and we love sports, but most of all, we love kvelling over Jews in sports.
Together we host Menschwarmers, the longest running Jewish sports podcast in the world. Listen and subscribe at thecjn.ca and wherever you find your podcasts.